Welcome to the Finance Marketing Podcast, a show that empowers finance professionals to market their businesses in ways that feel good and actually achieve results. I'm your host, Hillary. I've been working with folks in financial services to develop marketing strategies that work and create results-oriented marketing content since 2020. And I've learned a lot about what works in finance marketing, what doesn't work, and where financial services pros get stuck. Join us each Friday as we explore real, effective ways to market your finance business and connect with folks who truly embody your ideal clients. Today, I'm diving into a topic that I personally love to talk about because I find it to be a fun challenge or puzzle, but one that I know is a sticking point for many financial advisors. And this topic is creating engaging content while staying compliant with industry regulations. And the reason I think this topic is so important is one, because you need to stay within industry regulations, and two, because I've talked to many advisors over the years who don't create much content simply because they're afraid their compliance department won't approve it. And they are really just restricting themselves from improving their marketing, connecting with more prospects, connecting with their peers and colleagues, and really just enjoying all the benefits of creating content. Now, before we dive in, I want to note that this episode is specifically for financial advisors. I know that many of my listeners are also financial coaches or maybe other types of financial services professionals. And now, if you are a financial coach or a financial therapist or the like, and you are listening, some of these principles might still be helpful, but you generally have a lot more flexibility in your content creation since you're not under the same regulatory requirements. Now, of course, you still don't want to be misleading people or making false statements or anything like that. So what we're talking about today does apply specifically to financial advisors, but it may still be helpful for other financial services professionals. Now, I just can't tell you how many conversations I've had with advisors who feel completely stuck between wanting to share valuable insights with their audience, but worrying about crossing compliance lines. So rest assured, in my 5 years of doing this and writing content for financial advisors, I know that it is absolutely possible to create compelling content while staying within those guardrails of compliance, even if you feel like your compliance department is the most restrictive one on the planet. So let's break this down into a few key areas that will help you create content and get it through compliance without pulling your hair out. So I want to start with a story that really brings this home for me. Last year, I had Dave Armstrong from Monument Wealth Management on the podcast. And if you don't know Dave, he is an absolute delight. He's funny. He kind of reminds me of Robin Williams. He is authentic on every single platform that he shows up on. And he and his team create so much content. It's incredible. And during our conversation, he shared something about compliance that really changed how I think about this topic. Dave and Monument are not afraid to use four-letter words in their content and communication because that's how they talk naturally, and they want all of their marketing content to reflect what a relationship with them will really be like. And so he mentioned, there's actually no SEC rule against using certain language or, shall we say, colorful words in your content. What really matters and what it comes down to is that you're not misleading people. And this is the really crucial yet simple part. Compliance isn't about restricting your voice. It's about ensuring transparency and accuracy and ultimately just not misleading people. So that's the first myth that I like to bust when advisors are worried about what compliance is going to say about their content creation. 9 times out of 10, compliance doesn't really care how you say something, as long as what you're saying isn't providing specific investment recommendations or promising results or anything like that. And once you realize that, I think you realize just how much you can talk about in your content and how easy it is to talk about it in your natural, authentic voice. So let me start by sharing 3 foundational principles that I've seen make a real difference for advisors who are creating content. Number 1, focus on education over investment performance. When your primary goal is to help your audience understand complex financial topics rather than sell or promote specific investments, you are naturally going to create content that's more likely to get through compliance. So, for most of the advisors I know and work with, this is table stakes at this point. Most advisors that I know aren't talking about specific investments or specific investment performance or anything like that, but it's still worth mentioning. Now, the second principle is be really clear about what you can and can't promise. When it comes to compliance, there's not a lot that you can promise. You really don't want to be making promissory statements or absolutes or guarantees. So, this is actually pretty simple when you put it into practice. Rather than saying this strategy will protect your retirement savings, you might have to say something like, here's how this strategy is designed to help manage retirement risks. So it's a small shift in language, but it makes a really big difference from a compliance perspective. And I have often found that in working with compliance departments, it truly comes down to a single word change. That can be the difference between something being approved by compliance and something being outright rejected. Now, the third principle that I want to share with you is to make compliance a part of your creative process and not an afterthought. So think about potential compliance concerns when you're creating content and not after. If you're planning a series of social media posts about retirement planning, consider any compliance guidelines as you're drafting them. So include necessary disclaimers as you're drafting them, avoid problematic terms that you know is going to bother compliance, and structure your content in a way that's more likely to get approved. And I'll share a little bit more about this in a minute. So the fewer corrections your compliance department has to make, the more they will love you. Now, keep in mind, it is okay in the beginning as you're kind of learning what the words and phrases are that you need to avoid. That's fine. Compliance will work with you. But as you go forward and you submit more and more content, submitting content that is free of those things is going to establish better rapport with them. Now, one thing that often gets overlooked in conversations about compliance and content creation is the relationship that you develop with your compliance department itself. I think there's sometimes a perception that compliance is, quote unquote, the department of no, but really that couldn't be further from the truth. Because ultimately, your compliance department wants to see you succeed. They're really not there to stop you from creating content. They're there to protect you and your firm, and their job is to help you create content that won't put you or your firm at risk. So, really, they're the good guys. And I've seen this firsthand with many of the advisors that I work with. Those who approach their compliance departments as partners rather than adversaries tend to have much smoother content approval processes. So instead of creating content and hoping that it gets approved by compliance, I have seen a lot of success in advisors who have a marketing idea, go to their compliance department and run it by them first and ask them, how can we make this happen within the bounds that you need it to be in? So, this approach often leads to some really creative and collaborative problem solving. And I've seen a lot of compliance departments, when they're treated as more of a consultant, they're a lot more likely to be on board with your ideas. So, just a quick example here, maybe you want to start a podcast. Instead of recording your first 3 to 5 episodes and then finding out there are compliance issues, which would be frustrating and terrible for everyone, it's a better approach to work with compliance upfront to establish guidelines, create templates for disclaimers, and set up a review process that really works for everyone. And this kind of proactive collaboration often results in a much smoother approval process and better content in the long run. So, let me share a couple of things that I've seen work really well when it comes to building that relationship with your compliance department. First, try to set up regular check ins to discuss your content strategy. This doesn't have to be super formal. Even a quick monthly touch base can make a really big difference in keeping everyone aligned and making your compliance department feel like they're a valuable part of the process. Another thing that can be really nice is to simply ask your compliance team what makes content easiest for them to review. Sometimes it's as simple as formatting or organization, but you really won't know unless you ask, and you might be surprised by their answers. And speaking of making things easier, one practice that I absolutely love is creating a shared document of previously approved language. Think of it like a swipe file. When you get something approved, add it to the document, and over time, you build up this incredible resource of pre approved phrases and approaches that you can often swap out for language that you might have initially started with. This is actually something that my team does for each of our advisor clients as we kind of learn what phrases a particular compliance department flags or is particularly picky about. We'll create a list of those and keep them on hand for our team to review every time before they submit a draft. And it's just really, really helpful in, everyone is able to send in a draft that is automatically going to get approved and not get stuck in the compliance process. And then one of the biggest pieces of advice that I give to advisors is just be proactive about asking questions when you're unsure about something. It is always better to ask upfront than to create something and then find out that you can't use it. And this ties into my last point. Get your compliance team involved early in new marketing initiatives. Don't wait until you spend hours creating something or brainstorming something to bring them into the conversation. Get them on board from the get go. Now, the advisors who follow these practices typically have much smoother relationships with their compliance departments, and it really shows, honestly, in their ability to create and publish content consistently. So, here are a couple of practical systems that I've seen work really, really well. So, first, create templates for your most common types of content, especially if you're having to use things like disclosures on every piece of content you create. So, for example, if you regularly share market commentary on LinkedIn, create a template that already includes your standard disclosures and anything else that might be required. This is going to save you time and it makes your compliance review so much smoother because they're looking at a format that they're familiar with and that they're already comfortable with. Another system that is an absolute must have is to build a content calendar that factors in compliance review time. I know from working with advisors that nothing is more stressful than rushing to get something approved at the last minute, especially if it's time sensitive. So, especially for advisors who are sending things out like monthly newsletters, and let's say your monthly newsletter is themed around Valentine's Day or around the holidays or around an election cycle or something like that, and you send it to compliance and it gets stuck and it's in compliance for so long that by the time you get it back, the time that it's relevant has passed. That's really sad for everyone involved. So try to have it ready for review at least a week before you plan to send it, if not more, especially depending on the type of content that it is. This gives you breathing room for any necessary revisions without throwing off your whole schedule and forcing you to recreate something because the time has passed. I think this is actually most important for podcasters and YouTubers who really want to stick to a consistent publication schedule, which is important for your audience. I know some financial advisor podcasters, if not most, who are months ahead of schedule with podcast episodes because they know it's going to take time for each podcast to get through compliance. So they've built up quite a bank so that they can, continue posting weekly or bi-weekly or whatever their publication schedule is. And then again, I mentioned this previously, but it bears repeating because it's so important. Keep track of what your compliance department typically flags. So if there are certain phrases that always get questioned or specific topics that they like extra documentation around, keep notes on those patterns because over time, you will develop an intuitive sense of what is likely to get approved, what might need a little bit more workarounds, what might need more revision, and this can save you quite a lot of back and forth. This is really, really helpful if you ever decide to outsource marketing to a member of your team, maybe an admin person on your team, or if you're bringing in an outside agency to help support you. This can be really, really valuable. Like I mentioned, in my agency, we create these lists for each advisor that we work with as we learn what their compliance department is particularly picky about. And it is really helpful for our team to review them when they're submitting drafts. It's often as simple as doing a quick control find on words and phrases that always get flagged, and then we can quickly replace those with approved phrases, if they've snuck their way in during the writing process. Now, before we wrap up, I want to talk about some common compliance pitfalls that I see advisors run into with their content. And I'm not just talking about obvious things like making performance guarantees, which I know you would never do. These are more subtle issues that can trip you up if you're not watching for them. So, first, let's talk about absolute statements. It is so tempting when you're writing content to say things like, this strategy will protect your retirement savings, or estate planning ensures your family will be protected should you pass away. But these kinds of absolute statements are compliance red flags. So instead, focus on explaining how things work and what factors influence outcomes and what the purpose of specific strategies are. So the purpose is often to mitigate risks rather than remove them entirely and things like that. So rather than saying a strategy always works, you might explain the conditions under which it tends to be most effective. Now, another big one I see is around testimonials. Now, thanks to the new SEC marketing rule, which actually isn't so new anymore, advisors can use testimonials, but there are a lot of specific requirements around how you do this. Now, advisors are rightfully excited about finally being able to share client success stories and reviews that clients have given them, but then they forget about including the required disclosures or documenting everything properly, or even the process they've gone through to source reviews from their clients. So, if you're planning to use testimonials in your marketing, make sure that you understand all the requirements first. And if you want to dive deeper into this topic, I did record a great episode last year with Brian Thorpe about the SEC marketing rules. So go give that a listen if you haven't before. Now, here's another subtle one: using jargon or technical terms without proper explanation. From a compliance perspective, you need to ensure your content is very clear and not misleading in any way. So, this means either avoiding industry jargon altogether, which I would recommend for everyone who is listening. Just avoid the jargon altogether and use simple layman terms. Or if you simply have to use jargon in something, take the time to explain those terms in plain language. So, remember, the goal is always to educate and inform, not to confuse or impress someone with the level of your technical knowledge. Now, the last pitfall I want to mention is something called implied promises. These are statements that are not direct guarantees, but things that could be interpreted as promises about future performance or outcomes. So, for example, saying something like, our retirement planning process will give you peace of mind might seem harmless, but it could be seen as a guarantee. And I will just say, having worked with several compliance departments over the years, the phrase peace of mind is almost always going to get flagged. Compliance departments really hate that phrase, and they also hate the phrase, it will help you sleep better at night. We do not want to be getting into people's stress levels or anxiety levels or anything like that. So instead, you might say something like, our retirement planning process is designed to help address common concerns and questions about retirement. Now, to wrap us up, I want to leave you with something important to remember. Creating compliant content does not mean creating boring content. Some of the most engaging financial content I have seen comes from advisors who have mastered working within compliance guidelines while maintaining their authentic voice. Advisors like Dave Armstrong are a great example of this. His firm Monument puts out content that's engaging. Sometimes they even use colorful language, but they stay well within compliance guidelines because they understand the fundamental principle. It's not about restricting your voice. It's about being transparent and not misleading people. So here's what I hope you take away from today's episode. First, view your compliance department as partners, not as obstacles. Second, build compliance considerations into your content creation process from the beginning rather than treating it as an afterthought. And finally, remember that the guardrails of compliance are there to protect both you and your clients, and they don't have to limit your creativity or even your effectiveness. So if you found this episode helpful, I would love it if you would subscribe to the Finance Marketing Podcast on your favorite listening app. You can sign up for the newsletter in the show notes so you never miss an episode. And if you're feeling generous, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts because your support helps more finance professionals find the show. Thank you so much for listening, and I will catch you next time on the Finance Marketing Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Finance Marketing Podcast. If you're eager to market your business in a way that feels good and actually gets results, sign up for the Finance Marketing Podcast newsletter in the show notes so you never miss another episode. If you liked what you heard today, please be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite listening app and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. We'll see you back here next Friday.